Hi guys. So today I want to talk around the area of dealing with people's emotions and how offended they feel when you're dealing with things such as feedback. So for example, this could be in the form of work-based management, appraisals, performance management, and you or your team being afraid to share the truth with each other about their performance for fear of offense and people being upset, and then also to take it to the bottom, or for you guys to lead to the bottom, is what people derive from that. Is how messages get lost in translation, and how now you're not talking about the thing you're meant to be talking about, but you're just talking about that person's feelings and how no one's ever liked them and they never get the support, and it's always turned to something. I'm not attacking anybody because, of course, there's two sides to every story. But from the person presenting that feedback, what does that do to you when the person's always offended, and also the person receiving it, if it's not done exactly perfectly in a way that you can completely understand and take the feedback in bite size, what does it do to diminish you when it feels like you're just being trashed rather than being supported? So what are all the negative connotations of this thing of people's emotions right now when dealing with criticism and maybe disagreements in anything to do with their work, how they present themselves, how they speak, how they write, any part of their work that you can't really give honest feedback to now?
Yeah, there's a certain amount of this stuff you can't mitigate for, right? You can't preempt always how someone is going to take something and what they may choose to take offense to. There's just a certain amount of this you can't mitigate for. So I can think of a scenario where someone was chosen to give feedback to someone else on a lesson that they delivered, and they gave that person the feedback. Obviously some of it was good, some of it was developmental, and other person just completely flipped out. Now obviously you could pick at that and say, okay, maybe there are other reasons in there, and I'll give that person the benefit of the doubt and say that there weren't. But yeah, you could just be trying to help someone along and you don't know what it is that will set them off. So then it's just really, really difficult to give, especially developmental feedback, especially when you don't know what will trigger someone.
Yeah.
I think some people are also not very good at giving feedback that is, which might be true, but harsh or something that's negative. So if you're not able to, if you don't have that personable nature and you are very matter of fact and you work in black and white, we've seen that with people before. They're not able to quite coach someone through an issue. They just say, this is how I think you are at this, and it does cause offense. So I think how that message is delivered is really important, because if you're not going to be supportive about it, but it is something that needs to be done or corrected, then that I can see why that would cause offense.
Yeah, but then also, I guess also you create an issue by not giving someone the right honest feedback. It's like not disciplining a child, you create a monster. And so if someone's not doing a piece of work right and you're afraid to tell them, they're going to keep doing it, believing they're right. And now they're almost justified in turning around to you saying, why are you telling me this now? Because now what you're doing is you're critiquing them for a longer period of time, which hurts them even more. And so it just drives the whole thing downwards, and the work's not getting done. The person's got a false sense of security. You're anxious because you know eventually either you're going to fix what they're doing, or you're going to have to keep managing it in the wrong way, or you're going to have to eventually face your fears and go and tell them what you should have told them ages ago. So you're creating an even bigger problem for the whole company at that point.
It is a little bit of a sticky one, because some, people by default generally want to avoid conflict. And in that scenario, I mean, you've kind of got to run into it and negotiate it, navigate it as best as possible. Someone, let's say a good friend of yours, and they put on a lot of weight, and you want to find a way to tell them, look, you put on a bit of weight. I think that this is someone that wants to stay fit. You put on a bit of weight. Maybe you should try doing this, exercising this, eating that, blah 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 blah. Like, how do you start those conversations? The stereotypical thing of, well, do I look fat in this, or do I look so? And there's almost a whole joke around, being blunt and the response you get, or lying about it and the response you get. There's a general thing around this, around giving someone bad news that they need, a bad truth that they need to hear. It is something that we as a civilization just struggle with.
In the world. I mean, in the 7 habits of highly effective people, I think it's the 5th one, which talks about the battle between consideration and courage. If you've got low consideration and high courage, then you're going to sometimes bully people into doing what you want and not care about how they feel. And if you've got high consideration, low courage, sometimes you're going to keep accepting bad things because you're too worried about what the other person feels, but you're actually afraid to say what needs to be said. And both of those things can be bad. In a society where everybody almost creates their own dividing lines of what I'm allowed to be offended by, of what I should put up with at work or otherwise, then it's really tricky. I don't think there's very many universal standards of what we expect from each other as far as commitment and sacrifice, or if that's maybe that's too harsh a word, but in terms of what am I supposed to give? I did a piece of training, obviously with Proex the other day, and talked about conscientiousness and what overworking is. And the first thing we tried to do was agree, what is a good day's work? What do we think a good day's work is to everybody? And you'd be surprised that people think differently about what a good day's work is. Some people it's about how they feel. That actually I feel rested, I feel okay, I don't feel stressed. But other people it's that the job gets done. But other people it's that I don't, get things wrong. And so, or I've provided value. And it's like, there's so many different metrics behind what I'm supposed to be doing anyway, that I can pick almost, maybe it's the wrong word, what I'm offended by, or what's too far for you as a manager or a colleague to tell me, because I don't ascribe to that. I don't agree that I should be that way, to use your same analogy. And so it's like, if the person has come to you, like they said, and they told you I want to be a certain weight or a certain size, then it's easier for you to give feedback against it. But in a world where it's not clear what weight people want to be, and we'll probably move off this analogy eventually, it's harder to give that feedback.
That's a hard example to you'd have to know that person said that this is where I want to be and help me stay on track. At work, there are goals and targets and KPIs that you have to meet, and they are usually, sometimes not, but usually if you're a good company and you've got good planning, they should be clear. And if they are not met, it should just be straightforward. You're 5% below this KPI. These are the consequences if you don't get it up, or you don't move up into the threshold where you should be. And it is at work, you're able to create those lines that you're not able to create personally sometimes with the weight example. And it really and you as managers, we should be training whoever, our managers and our staff, to go, this is what we measure ourselves against. And if you don't like it, you have the option to leave.
And while you're presenting some solutions, is there also a trouble for going too far and not having that consideration for people? What damage could that do when you are brutal, I suppose, and blunt with your...
I don't think that's brutal. I think it's, if you've said this is how we are going to measure our success as a company, it could be financial, it could be quality, whatever it is, whatever that department works towards, and you've said this is what it is, you've hired people on that basis, then why are people affected, or why can't people give that kind of feedback? If you haven't taught them to give that kind of feedback, well, they're not clear on what their KPIs are, what the goals are, then of course they're going to feel uncomfortable giving that kind of feedback. So maybe it comes from the lines of management, is that somewhere someone isn't giving the right feedback, and it will continue down the line.
I think what you're doing is providing a strong response to this rather than the safe response, which would be, hey, you can go too far. And I think I kind of like what you're saying, is that you manage the expectation first. If you create the expectation of what our standard is, then you can hold people to it. If you don't have a standard, then people can do what they want. And it's very hard to rein it back in. And maybe that's, in society, it's harder to create one standard because there's different faiths, different structures, different beliefs, different politics. So how do you create one standard to hold people to? But inside a company, you need to create a standard. And you won't capture everything, because the things that people come and report to you, they're offended by, some of them are going to blow your mind and you never would have thought about, and you'll never see them again. But there should be at least a code of ethics and a standard that cover most of the things, that at least on the professional side of things, in terms of what people should have the right to be offended by. Otherwise,
you haven't, if it's about the work and feedback of work, it means that we as managers haven't created a system where you can measure that. And if you haven't created a system to measure it, and therefore you could make various judgments about how well someone is doing, or how well someone isn't doing, then that's the structure's fault. It's the goals and strategies not being worked out.
I guess I'll throw another question in there briefly, and this could be a whole topic by itself. And we've definitely had this discussion, Jankee, several times, and maybe interesting to see what Charlie thinks. Sometimes there's what you believe is right, and then there's what has the results. And when you're dealing with people, people aren't rational. And so there's things that on paper are correct and logically are sound, but when you put people in the mix, it just doesn't work. Shouldn't you almost back off the hill when you realize that as much as this is correct, people aren't going to respond well to this. People are going to be offended, people are going to be upset. And so even though I have a standard and I'm holding to what I've agreed and what we've agreed together, this still isn't going to get me the results I want.
So I feel like I already know where Jankee's gonna fall on this. But you know what? You're ultimately, yeah, I do see the point you're trying to hint at. You're managing people, aren't you? And yes, you are still looking at the same measurables, the same KPIs, but the way that you deliver the news has to factor in the person that is sat in front of you. It just has to a certain extent. Now, that doesn't mean you sugarcoat the truth. That doesn't mean you avoid the hard facts, but it has to factor in the person that's in front of you. And actually, sometimes it has to factor in the situation that they have been through, maybe some extenuating circumstances. And yeah, I know that can be a slippery slope. And then, so-and-so happened on such and such day, and my cat died, and no offense to cats out there. But like, yeah, it just does have to factor into a certain extent the person that's sat in front of you. That's just my stance on it.
No, I completely agree. I think you've got to deliver that message appropriately. But if you've got the backing of a strong strategy and strong goals and strong KPIs, then it should be clear that it's either met or not met. Completely take into account COVID, illnesses, like absolutely you take that into account. But the job has either been done or not been done. The bills are either being paid or not being paid, and the bank doesn't give us that leniency, maybe an overdraft.
I guess what Deola's hinting at is, it's about the management of it, right? Can you tweak it in a way where, okay, actually, I think if I do it this way, this will get me a better result than just saying, ooh.
But doesn't that also, you're doing that because people are going to be offended? You're creating the softness because we are scared that people are going to be offended. And that's the problem. This is the problem that you're bringing, your first problem. But actually, if you don't say these are the facts of whether a company is achieving its
I guess
goals or not.
The merger of what you're both saying is that you have to find a way to make the news palatable, but you have to left the message at the end. So by the end of whatever your discussion, it needs to be clear what isn't acceptable. And you might need to make wholesale changes to the way you deliver something, even if there was nothing wrong per se with how you deliver to a certain demographic. You hear footballers talk about at the time about the dressing room changing and how the culture before, when you came in and respected the old pros and washed their boots and all this kind of stuff, and you never had a phone in the dressing room, whereas now it's a different generation. At half the time they're on their phones, and people had to adapt and deal with it. You can't just, like, I know Alex Ferguson's famous hairdryer treatment of just shouting at people. I don't think every young player takes that anymore. They don't feel like that's society. So as much as things might seem correct, you kind of have to change them and find a way to get your message through, but that's still tricky. So I guess because we're coming up to time, how would you deal with that in that specific scenario of an appraisal or feedback that's being given, which you believe is accurate, and maybe it's not being given by you, it's been given by someone else, and actually it's really upset somebody to the point where it might have disenfranchised them somehow? How do you go about dealing with that? One reasonable, one irrational way, or less reasonable way of dealing with that, so that the person, you don't lose the person, but you also don't lose the message?
I could go rational. It's going to be a little bit boring. There's nothing wrong with a good old feedback sandwich. Positive, negative, positive, or positive, developmental, positive, or even just positive, developmental. That sandwich could only have one slice of bread. But, sometimes, because people don't respond well, right, to just the negatives. So, good old feedback sandwich. And sometimes it may not taste that nice.
there are some schools of thought that the positive sandwich just hides the negative bit and people will remember what they want to remember and they leave the rest. And so as much as that's a popular school of thought, I agree. There is some people who say when you do that, you just allow the person to almost like be ignorant to the negative bit because there's two positive bits wrapped around it. So it's worth but that's why it's reasonable.
It's about do you negatively reinforce or do you positively reinforce or motivate? Negatively motivate or positively motivate. How much meat is inside the sandwich? I mean, there's different ways to do it.
And something more rational then.
That was rational.
Yes.
Mine's radical.
Yes, radical.
But I mean, I don't. This is not my view. Just saying that. But you set your,
Speak from the heart, Jankee.
No, this is not my view. Because I'm more of that. You know, you do the good and the bad. But if you just stick with your guns, and someone who's running a company is running it because they believe that they should be running a company, they're taking on the risk. It's their name on company's house. It's their name on the bank. You tell people when they're not doing stuff, and you also tell people where they are doing stuff. You're quite matter of fact about it, and you kind of have to put the feelings at the door and say, this is how we judge our company. This is how we measure our success. So I will measure you in the same way because it's how we'll be measured. And if you make that clear right from the beginning, it's not that radical, but I don't think it would go down well, but that is the more straightforward but slightly radical way.
Okay.
Words, I like it.
All right, well, bear them both in mind. The next time that I have the any issues that follow what we talked about today. So thanks both.